The shutters of Willow Creek breathed in the Georgia heat like a living thing, sighing as late sun laid long bars of light across the polished floors. The black crepe on the brass knocker had already begun to fade, but the smell of camphor and beeswax, the scent of mourning and scrubbing, still clung to the grand hall. Elizabeth Thornwell stood at the window of her late brother's house, eyes on the cotton fields that rolled away in a pale, windless sea. The Spanish moss lifted and fell, lifting and falling, as if the trees themselves had taken up a slow, measured respiration. The lawyer's satchel had closed an hour ago, words spoken in the study, legal words that sounded like the clink of invisible chains, had made Elizabeth sole mistress of Willow Creek and guardian to her brother's daughters. There were figures on paper that Elizabeth had accepted with only the slightest movement in her jaw, debts that a gentleman would call bridgeable, that a widow would call ruin, and that Elizabeth called a challenge to be managed. The plantation itself was land, rich and cash, poor in a season when rain had been stingy and markets fickle, but it still bore a harvest that could be coaxed into coin, and within its ledgers, in neat columns inked by a dead man's hand, were listed 46 names that were not counted as people at all. Value, the law called it, assets, a vocabulary that could make a whip sound like arithmetic. Miss Elizabeth, Samuel, the house steward, had the careful voice of a man who had learned to measure every syllable. "The young ladies are in the parlor as you requested." "Very good," she said, smoothing her mourning dress as if to iron creases out of fate itself. "I'll be there presently." It was a long walk down the hall, made longer by portraits that watched her pass. Jonathan's painting, sun-browned, genial. A man who smiled with his eyes had been turned to face the wall when the coffin went into the ground. Elizabeth did not turn it back. She preferred a house that looked forward. To linger was to sink. The girls rose when she entered. Charlotte, 17, stood at once with the reflex of someone trained to be brave in company. Abigail, 15, tucked a loose curl behind her ear and tried to assemble gentleness into a shield. Mary, 13, clutched a cloth doll that had gone grey from being washed and rewashed until it knew only the smell of lie and fear. "Sit," Elizabeth said, and they obeyed in the same motion. "You understand," she continued, "that your father's passing changes everything. This house, and all within it, are under my care. What prospers here will be because we shoulder what must be shouldered without complaint." Charlotte's hands were neatly folded in her lap, but Elizabeth saw the whitened knuckles. "Father said we would always have a home here, and so you shall," Elizabeth replied, voice as cool as water ladled from a deep well. "But everything in this life has a price. The estate carries obligations. Willow Creek requires proper management. There will be no waste. We'll help however we can," Abigail offered. The words were soft, as though speaking gently might soften the world. Elizabeth's mouth curved into something like a smile. "You are of age, Charlotte. Abigail will be, soon enough. Mary in time. Your father's connections in Savannah will be useful. A proper match is work well done." Charlotte did not move, yet something in her stilled further. "I had hoped to continue my studies," she said, and it was a hopeful sentence, crafted like an apology. "Foolishness," Elizabeth said so lightly it struck like a slap. "Books have taught you to confuse preference with purpose. A house is built by fitting pieces as they are, not as they imagine themselves to be." Silence ballooned in the parlor, too big for the room. A mockingbird called from the live oak outside, gathering other sounds and throwing them back in a voice large enough to mimic anything. "You will attend social calls next month," Elizabeth continued. "I have already received inquiries. There are families whose names open doors, and doors once opened are not shut to those who step quickly." Mary's eyes brightened with a child's desperate logic. "But what about Charlotte's writing? Papa always—" "Your father," Elizabeth said, and the past tense was underscored like a line drawn hard in ink, "indulged you to your detriment. That ends now. Each of you will be an asset to this house, useful, presentable, obedient." She looked to Samuel, who waited in the doorway as quietly as a shadow cast by furniture. "Ensure the girls' wardrobes are made appropriate to a season of mourning. Remove the frivolities." Later, when the hall swallowed their footsteps and the door clicked shut, the three sisters breathed as if they had been underwater, surfacing and finding the air less generous than they remembered. "Lottie," Mary whispered, using the childhood name she rarely said in daylight. Charlotte went to the window. The path to the quarters was being lit by a line of lanterns. The yellow beads looked like a necklace around a throat. "We will endure," she said softly. "Father taught us that difference between polite and powerless." She pressed her fingertip to the cool glass where the light broke into a thin spear. We will be neither. By evening, the house had already begun its quiet transformation. The parlor books Jonathan had allowed poetry wearing its grief like a clean shirt. Histories that suggested nations could choose to be better had vanished, replaced by instruction on deportment and the correction of female faults. The gowns Charlotte and Abigail loved, colors that remembered sky and river, were boxed away for charity. Fabric the color of undertakers took their place. Charlotte's resistance began where resistance often does, in the small geographies that can be defended. She lifted 2 loose floorboards and slid a volume of Shakespeare into the cool dark, along with a stub of pencil and a journal she had begun the night her father's fever crested. Beneath the house, the wood held its breath around her secrets. When the rest of Willow Creek slept, she lit the smallest candle and wrote until wax kissed her knuckles. She had filled only half a page on morning, and the tyranny of quiet voices when footsteps paused outside her room. The key turned. Elizabeth entered with the soundless certainty of a woman who had taught doors to open before she reached them. In her hand, the journal from Charlotte's lap. "What is this?" Elizabeth asked. She did not read it. She weighed it in her palm as one might weigh a stone. "Private thoughts," Charlotte said, standing slowly. It was not defiance. Not yet. Only a refusal to be smaller than she was. "Nothing in this house is private from me," Elizabeth replied. She crossed to the fireplace. The fire had been banked for the night, coals sleeping under ash. Elizabeth took the poker, stirred the embers to a sudden orange eye, and lowered the journal into heat. The pages curled with a soft paper sigh and then blackened, buckled, and became nothing you could read anymore. "Your father's leniency made you willful," Elizabeth said, replacing the poker like a surgeon setting a clean instrument aside. "We will correct that." The door closed. The ash lifted, fell. Morning came brittle as a snapped twig. Samuel appeared with word of a luncheon in Savannah. A Mr. Blackwood would be hosting a widower with interests in ships and votes. He was a man whose smile had a ledger in it. He was also, Charlotte thought as she sat later at his table under a chandelier that hummed with trapped heat, a man who looked at a person as if assessing the quality of the wood in her bones. He spoke gently as men scuff the ground gently with the toe of a boot to test if it will bear weight. "Your aunt speaks highly of your sense of duty," he said. "A household prospers when its lady is adaptable." "My interests are not solely domestic," Charlotte replied, choosing each word as if it might bruise if mishandled. "A spirited nature can be redirected," he said, smiling in a way that did not commit his eyes to the expression, "with proper guidance." The carriage rumbled home over roads that remembered rain as a rumor. Elizabeth sat beside Charlotte with the contained satisfaction of someone who has pushed a heavy thing and felt it begin to move. "You will encourage Mr. Blackwood's attentions," she said, not looking away from the field where the cotton stood with its white fists unopened. "His offer would settle your father's obligations entirely." "He is older than father," Charlotte said. It was nearly nothing, that sentence, but it used her voice anyway. "Age brings wisdom and the capacity to act on it," Elizabeth told the window. "Romantic notions are a luxury, and the price of them is always paid by someone other than the woman who indulges them." Night sank gently onto the house. From Charlotte's window, the lanterns again stitched a chain toward the quarters. She thought of Hannah, pregnant and too thin, and of the way kindness is punished when it travels the wrong direction. She thought of the library and its vanished books, of her journal turned to cinder, of Mr. Blackwood's measured politeness and the ledger in his gaze. Abigail slipped into the room in bare feet, a ghost of a girl. "What will happen to us?" Charlotte did not have enough promises to hand out. She took her sister's hand anyway. "We will keep each other. When the world acts like a mouth that intends to swallow us, we will wedge ourselves sideways in its throat." In the yard below, Thomas Cooper, the new overseer whose name people spoke like they were tasting iron, walked the line of lamps with a whip coiled neat at his side. He paused and stared up at the lit window until the back of Charlotte's neck crawled. Then he moved on as if to say, "I have all the time in the world." Far away, thunder stitched itself into a seam the clouds could not hold. The first pale breath of a storm touched the live oaks and made the moss shiver as though the trees had heard a story and disliked the ending. Charlotte, still holding Abigail's hand, felt the house around them settle into a darker silence, a silence that was not rest but rehearsal. Somewhere between the stairs and the study, Elizabeth Thornwell paused in the hall and looked toward the turned portrait of her brother. She did not touch it. She adjusted a candlestick by half an inch, exactly half an inch, and continued on, satisfied that things were nearly aligned. The night wore on. The air thickened. The storm moved closer. And in the trembling quiet before the first drop struck the first leaf, Charlotte understood that their father's house had become a stage, and that every kind word and every cruel one would be a mark in chalk telling each player where to stand when the curtain finally rose. The storm broke over Willow Creek with a sound like canvas tearing, rain thrashing the roof and finding every weakness in the shutters. The house seemed to hold its breath under the weight of the weather, but inside, Elizabeth Thornwell was already thinking of the future with the clear precision of a chess player who sees the whole board before the pieces have moved. The girls were summoned to the parlor the next morning, the air still heavy with damp wood and the faint metallic tang that follows lightning. The grand mirror above the fireplace had been polished until it reflected them back with merciless clarity. 3 young faces pale against black dresses, 3 sets of shoulders not yet rounded by years of submission. Elizabeth sat like a judge at trial, her mourning gown severe, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You are Thornwells," she said, "and that name carries weight, even in diminished times. The family must not only endure but prosper, and that prosperity will come in part through you." Charlotte's gaze flicked toward her sisters. She saw Abigail's throat move in a swallow, Mary's fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. "I will be arranging introductions," Elizabeth continued, her tone brisk, efficient. "Charlotte, you are ready. Abigail, you are close behind. Mary, your time will come. A family of standing in Savannah has already made inquiries." Charlotte steadied herself. "I had hoped to continue my education," she began, voice careful. "Father wished me to." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to hers, sharp as broken glass. "Your father's indulgence has been the root of your willfulness. Education for women beyond what is necessary is dangerous. It encourages ideas of independence of purpose beyond their proper sphere. A woman's duty is not to clutter her head with philosophy, but to secure the strength of her household." Charlotte's jaw tightened. In her chest, her father's memory rose like a tide, the way he had placed books in her hands, telling her that words could be weapons sharper than steel. She held the silence, rather than give her aunt the satisfaction of hearing defiance aloud. Abigail, gentle as always, tried to mend the moment. "We'll do what we can, Aunt. We want Willow Creek to flourish." Elizabeth allowed herself the smallest tilt of her head, an acknowledgement that obedience, real or feigned, was currency. "Good. Then you will each learn to move as I instruct. We will attend luncheons and balls. You will wear the colors of mourning until I say otherwise. You will be watched and weighed and courted, and in time matched to men who will settle our debts and elevate this house." Mary, still only a child, blurted out, "But what about Charlotte's writing?" Papa said. The sound of Elizabeth's hand striking the arm of the chair cut her short. "Your father is gone," she said coldly. "What he permitted is no longer of consequence. From this moment, your worth is measured not in dreams but in usefulness. You are assets. I will see to it that each of you is placed where you belong." The words landed like stones in the parlor, heavy and inescapable. That evening, Charlotte lingered by her window, watching the last of the storm roll away, lanterns flickering again along the path to the slave quarters. Her father's rule, lenient by the cruel standards of Georgia, had at least offered the enslaved a fragile kindness, but Elizabeth was already undoing it, replacing measured humanity with ruthless efficiency. Abigail slipped into her room, pale from crying. "What will become of us?" she whispered. Charlotte drew her close. "We endure, Abby. Father taught us to endure." Abigail hesitated. "I overheard Cook today. Aunt Elizabeth sold 2 people already, Moses and his daughter Lily. They were taken away this afternoon." Charlotte's breath caught. Moses had been at Willow Creek longer than she had been alive. His absence left a silence as sharp as a missing tooth. "We must be careful," she whispered, "very careful." Later that night, voices pulled Charlotte from her bed. She crept to the landing, heart pounding. The study door was ajar, lamplight spilling out. Inside, she saw Elizabeth seated with a stranger. Tall, expensively dressed, his eyes as cold and polished as coins. "The eldest has spirit," Elizabeth was saying. "That will need breaking, but managed properly, she'll bring a substantial bride price from the right family." "And if she resists?" the man asked. Elizabeth's laugh was brittle, like ice cracking on glass. "There are always ways to ensure compliance, Mr. Blackwood. Always ways." Charlotte withdrew silently, her pulse hammering in her ears. In that instant, the fragile line between childhood and adulthood snapped. They were no longer only daughters grieving a father. They were commodities on a ledger, pawns in a ruthless game their aunt had already begun to play. Within a fortnight of Elizabeth's reign, the transformation of Willow Creek was undeniable. The shelves once heavy with poetry and history stood bare. Instructional manuals on etiquette and submission replaced them. The bright dresses her father had allowed were boxed away. In their place came somber fabrics that bound rather than freed. Even meals were altered, less variety, stricter schedules, as though joy itself was wasteful. Charlotte's resistance began as small acts. She smuggled her father's books beneath the floorboards. She wrote by candlelight when all others slept. Each secret sentence felt like a breath stolen back from suffocation, but Elizabeth was watchful, unnervingly so. One morning she appeared in Charlotte's room holding the girl's hidden journal. "Scribbling nonsense instead of practicing your needlework," she said, and without ceremony tossed it into the fire. The flames curled the words Charlotte had written into smoke that stung her eyes. "Your father's leniency made you unruly," Elizabeth said flatly. "That ends now." That afternoon, Charlotte found herself escorted to a luncheon in Savannah, placed at the side of Hezekiah Blackwood himself. He was 43, a widower whose name carried both political clout and whispered unease. His gaze weighed her like livestock. "Your aunt praises your domestic talents," he said, his tone polished but empty. "My interests extend beyond the domestic sphere, sir," Charlotte replied carefully. He smiled in a way that was more calculation than expression. "A spirited nature can be redirected, with guidance." The words clung to her like smoke. On the carriage ride home, Elizabeth gripped Charlotte's wrist hard enough to bruise. "You will encourage Mr. Blackwood's attentions. His offer would settle your father's debts entirely." Charlotte tried once more. "He is older than father was." "Age brings wisdom, connections, protection," Elizabeth said coldly. "Your childish fancies are of no consequence. You will do as you are told." That night, in the garden under a moon smudged by passing clouds, Charlotte wept into Abigail's shoulder. "She means to sell me," she whispered, "like one of the field hands, to a man who sees me as property." Abigail held her tight, eyes wet with her own tears. "Then we will find another way. We must." But from the shadows near the path, a figure lingered. Thomas Cooper, the new overseer, tipped his hat with mock courtesy. His reputation had arrived before him. A man who wielded the whip with zeal, who took pleasure in breaking spirits. His smile was a warning. "Your aunt requests your presence," he said. "You shouldn't wander unsupervised." As Charlotte walked past him, she felt the weight of his gaze pressing into her back, hot and merciless. It was the first night she understood the truth fully. Willow Creek was no longer her father's house. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in. The following morning, the air over Willow Creek carried a different kind of heaviness, not the aftermath of rain, but the silence of a house that was beginning to feel less like a home and more like a fortress. Charlotte sat at the breakfast table with Abigail and Mary, the three of them lined neatly like schoolgirls, watched over by Elizabeth Thornwell, who measured silence as if it were obedience itself. The door opened. Thomas Cooper entered without waiting to be invited. His boots left the faint smell of damp leather in the air, and he removed his hat with a courtesy that felt more like mockery. His eyes flicked to Charlotte, then to Abigail, pausing longer than politeness allowed before he spoke. "The fields are in order, ma'am," he said to Elizabeth. "I've begun the work of discipline. Your brother was far too lenient. The people are restless. Then you will correct them." Elizabeth replied smoothly. "Order is the spine of prosperity. Break it once, and everything collapses." Charlotte's hand clenched under the tablecloth. She remembered Moses and his daughter Lily sold away, as though they were no more than cattle. Their absence had hollowed the quarters, leaving behind grief that did not dare to be voiced. Now Cooper stood in their place, a man whose reputation had preceded him like a stain. After breakfast, Mary slipped into the kitchen. She was still tender-hearted enough to see hunger as wrong no matter where it lived. Hannah, a young enslaved woman heavy with child, had been given half rations in her final weeks of pregnancy. Mary, too young to calculate the dangers of kindness, had quietly carried bread and a piece of salted pork to her. Elizabeth discovered it before the day was out. The parlor was sharp with accusation. Mary stood trembling, eyes red, doll clutched so tightly her knuckles whitened. Elizabeth's voice was cold as marble. "You defied me. You interfered where you had no right. She's going to give birth soon," Mary stammered. "She's starving." Silence. Elizabeth's tone cracked like a whip. "The management of laborers is not your concern. Your punishment is no supper for a week." Charlotte stepped forward before she could stop herself. "She's 13, Aunt. Mercy is not weakness." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to her, gleaming with cruelty. "And you will share in her punishment for daring to question me." She turned to Cooper, who stood in the doorway like a wolf awaiting scraps. See that they remain confined this evening." "Yes, ma'am," he said, his grin slow and deliberate. Then, lowering his voice so only Charlotte could hear, "Your aunt has given me freedom to enforce discipline as I see fit. Remember that, Miss Thornwell." That night Charlotte lay awake, listening. Through her window she saw lanterns bobbing in the quarters, too many, moving too quickly. She pressed her hand to the glass. Something was wrong. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the servant Elizabeth had stationed in the hall. Barefoot, she crept down to the kitchen and gathered what she could. Clean cloths, a basin, the small vial of laudanum her father had once kept for emergencies. Then she stole into the storm-damp night, the grass cold against her feet, guided by the lanterns and the sound of voices rising in urgent waves. Hannah was in labor. The cries came sharp and ragged, filling the cramped cabin like thunder trapped in wood. The women gathered there looked to Charlotte with desperate eyes, their hands already red from effort. For a moment, Charlotte froze. She was only 17, only a girl with fragments of knowledge borrowed from books her father had left her. But she steadied herself, recalling his voice. "Do what you can with what you have. Fear is only the shadow that walks before courage." "Boil more water," she ordered. "Tear strips for bandages. Hold her steady." Hours passed. Sweat slicked Hannah's face, her body racked with the agony of bringing forth life into a world that had given her so little kindness. At last, as dawn broke and pale light filtered through the cracks in the boards, two cries joined hers. Twin boys, wriggling, gasping, alive. The women wept with joy. Hannah clutched her sons, exhausted, but smiling through tears. Charlotte's own arms trembled with relief as she cleaned her hands. For a brief moment, victory glowed inside her like a lantern against the darkness. But when she returned to the main house, triumph evaporated. Elizabeth was waiting in the hall, flanked by Thomas Cooper. "I see discipline requires a firmer hand," Elizabeth said, her voice colder than the morning air. "Mr. Cooper, make the necessary arrangements. Charlotte will depart for Savannah tomorrow. She will stay with the Blackwoods. Perhaps their supervision will succeed where mine has failed." Charlotte's blood chilled. She had heard the name Blackwood whispered already, had seen the man's sharp eyes at luncheon. To be sent to his house was not a visit. It was exile or worse, inspection before purchase. The chains her aunt had promised were invisible, but Charlotte felt their weight pressed down on her shoulders just the same. The carriage wheels rattled over the rutted road, carrying Charlotte farther from Willow Creek and deeper into a fate she had not chosen. Savannah loomed ahead, a city she had visited only once as a child, when her father had spoken proudly of its broad squares, shaded avenues, and harbor bustling with ships. Now, she saw none of that wonder. Every sound of iron against stone felt like the tightening of a lock. The Blackwood mansion stood behind wrought iron gates draped in ivy, its facade tall and forbidding. Spanish moss hung heavy from the oaks like the beards of old men whispering secrets. As Charlotte's carriage passed beneath the arch, the gates clanged shut with finality. Inside, the air smelled of polish and wealth leather, beeswax, rose water, but beneath it lingered something colder, like a cellar where light never reached. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winthrop, severe in grey silk, led Charlotte up the grand staircase without ceremony. "Mr. Blackwood expects you for tea at 4, she said. "Appropriate attire is in the wardrobe." Charlotte opened the wardrobe doors to find gowns more elaborate than anything she had owned. Pale blues and creams, fabrics that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. Costumes, she thought bitterly, meant to make her look delicate, innocent, an object to be displayed. At the appointed hour, she descended in one of those gowns. Hezekiah Blackwood awaited her in a parlor that smelled of cigars and old money. His smile was courteous, but his eyes stripped her bare. "Miss Thornwell," he said, rising with practiced elegance, "I trust you find your accommodations satisfactory." "They are generous," Charlotte replied carefully, her voice carrying the weight of every unspoken thought. He gestured to the tea service, his movements precise, controlled. "Your aunt speaks highly of you. She tells me you have a talent for the pianoforte." "I play," she admitted, her tone cautious. "Then you must favor me with a performance after tea." The conversation moved like a measured dance. He asked about her health, her education, her domestic capabilities, as if checking items on a ledger. Charlotte answered as little as possible, her mind racing beneath the surface calm. Later, she played at the piano, each note sharp with the knowledge that this was not admiration, it was assessment. That night, Mrs. Winthrop led her back to her room. The door clicked behind her with the sound of a lock, though none was visible. Charlotte stood in the silence, every muscle tense. She crossed to the window and pushed it open, letting the humid night air wash over her. Far below, the garden stretched in manicured lines. The gates were locked, the walls too high. The next morning, she wandered the halls cautiously, testing which doors were open and which were barred. In one corridor, she found a vast library floor-to-ceiling shelves brimming with books. For the first time since leaving Willow Creek, her heart stirred. She reached for a volume of Shakespeare, its leather cover familiar beneath her fingers. Most young ladies prefer romance novels to tragedies, a voice said. Startled, Charlotte turned. An elderly man sat in a leather armchair, thin and refined, with intelligent eyes that carried both sharpness and sorrow. "I'm Edward Blackwood," he said, rising with difficulty and offering a courteous bow. "My nephew's uncle, and, I fear, an unwelcome remnant in this household." Charlotte replaced the book carefully. "Charlotte Thornwell, I didn't mean to intrude." "Nonsense," he said, waving a frail hand. "Few come here anymore. Hezekiah prefers his ledgers to literature." Something in Edward's tone, genuine, uncalculated, invited honesty. Charlotte sat across from him, clutching the book to her chest. "It's beautiful," she admitted softly, "but confining." Edward chuckled, not unkindly. "An apt description of most beautiful things in this society." His gaze sharpened. "You are here as a prospective bride, I presume?" Charlotte's silence was answer enough. "I thought as much," he sighed. "Hezekiah has specific requirements for his next wife. His first, poor Margaret, failed to provide an heir before consumption claimed her. He believes fortune will not cheat him a second time." Charlotte's blood ran cold. She had suspected it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. Over the following days, Charlotte and Edward formed a strange alliance. In the quiet of the library, he told her the history of the Blackwood family, Hezekiah's ruthless rise in trade, his desperation for a male heir, his political manipulations in Savannah's society. Charlotte listened, her mind collecting fragments of information like stones to be sharpened into weapons. One night, restless, she peered from her window into the courtyard. Lanterns flickered. Men unloaded heavy crates from a wagon, moving with furtive urgency, and there, directing them with brutal efficiency, was Thomas Cooper, the overseer from Willow Creek. Her breath caught. What was he doing here? The following morning, feigning illness, Charlotte slipped away to investigate. She found the cellar Edward had once mentioned, and, with a hairpin, pried open the lock. The air was damp and foul, chains clinked faintly in the dark. And there, against the stone walls, she saw iron restraints and the unmistakable signs of human captivity. The Blackwoods were smuggling enslaved Africans illegally, long after the trade had been outlawed in 1808. They hid them here until they could be sold under false names, claimed as offspring of existing slaves. Charlotte staggered back, her hand pressed to her mouth. She turned to flee, only to collide with a solid form. Thomas Cooper blocked the doorway, his smile cruel and triumphant. "Curiosity," he drawled, gripping her arm with iron strength. "A dangerous habit in a young lady. Mr. Blackwood will be most displeased." Charlotte's pulse hammered in her ears. She forced her voice to steady. "If the authorities discover this, he'll lose more than his reputation." Cooper's laugh echoed off the stone. "Who do you think protects operations like this? Your aunt was right, you require correction before you'll make a suitable wife." He dragged her back toward the stairs. Each step thudded like the toll of a bell. And Charlotte knew, with a clarity that stole her breath, that her aunt had not simply sent her to Savannah as a ward. She had sold her into a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. Charlotte's world narrowed to the iron grip on her arm, and the dark hallway Cooper dragged her through. His stride was long and unyielding, her attempts to twist free useless against his brute strength. When they reached Hezekiah Blackwood's study, the heavy oak door closed behind them like the lid of a coffin. Blackwood sat at a wide mahogany desk, his hands folded with the composure of a man who rarely hurried. Papers were neatly stacked, a crystal decanter of brandy half empty at his elbow. He looked up, eyes glinting with a satisfaction that was more dangerous than rage. "Miss Thornwell," he said smoothly, "I had wondered how long it would take you to discover our lesser-known enterprises." Charlotte's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand straight as Cooper shoved her forward. "You're violating federal law," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The slave trade was banned nearly 40 years ago." Blackwood's lips curved, not in amusement, but in the weary patience of a man indulging a naive child. "Laws are paper, my dear. Influence is iron. There are senators in Washington who profit as I do. There are judges whose pockets are lined with the very ships that carry my goods. Do you think a girl's outrage is enough to topple such pillars?" Charlotte's stomach twisted. He spoke not as a villain boasting, but as a man reciting common sense. as if corruption itself were the natural order. "Your aunt warned me you were spirited," Blackwood continued. "Spirited mares require firm reins, but once broken, they serve better than any docile thing. I see no reason why the same principle should not apply to wives." Cooper chuckled, the sound low and ugly. Charlotte's fists clenched at her sides. For the next fortnight, she was kept under a scrutiny that felt more like surveillance than guardianship. Mrs. Winthrop hovered constantly, ensuring letters Charlotte wrote to her sisters contained nothing of truth. Every sentence was measured, every word censored. Still, Charlotte pressed harder on certain letters' secret code, a childish game she and Abigail had once invented to conceal gossip from their governess. Perhaps now it might carry a plea for help across miles. Each week, she was paraded at dinners and luncheons. Men twice her age assessed her like livestock at market, speaking of her as though she were not present. Blackwood himself was always near, his gaze appraising, his questions invasive in their polite disguise. It was Edward, frail but keen-eyed, who found her again in the library. He had noticed her paleness, the quiet way she carried herself, and spoke in low tones that could not be overheard. "You've seen what my nephew is," he murmured. "You understand, now." Charlotte nodded, her throat tight. "And you still live here?" "I am too old to leave, and my absence would confirm what little power remains to me. But I can still act in small ways." His gaze sharpened. "You must escape before the marriage contract is sealed. Afterward, the law will bind you to him as tightly as these walls do now." Her breath hitched. "Marriage? He hasn't even proposed." Edward's sigh was heavy with resignation. "For men like Hezekiah, proposals are for appearances. Contracts signed with your aunt already determine your fate. The ceremony will be announced in weeks." Charlotte's knees weakened, and she sank into a chair. The thought of vows spoken not as a promise but as a trap nearly suffocated her. "Listen carefully," Edward said, leaning close. "He leaves tomorrow for Charleston on business. That is your window. I cannot accompany you, but I can provide two things." From his waistcoat, he withdrew a small brass key and a folded letter sealed with wax. "The key opens the garden gate. The letter contains instructions and enough funds to secure passage north. Trust no one else." Charlotte's fingers closed around the objects, her pulse racing with a mixture of terror and hope. "Why help me?" Edward's expression softened, a glimpse of sorrow in his eyes. "I failed to protect others, my sister-in-law Margaret, perhaps even my own daughters. If I can see you free, it may balance the ledger before I meet my end." That night, Charlotte sat at her writing desk, pen trembling over parchment. Mrs. Winthrop hovered by the door, but Charlotte bent her words into shapes only Abigail might understand. She pressed harder on certain letters, hiding a message beneath the ink. "Hope is near. Watch the skies. I will not vanish willingly." Later, she slipped the brass key beneath her pillow, its sharp edges biting faintly against her skin. In the silence, she could almost hear her father's voice. "Fear is a shadow, Lottie. The substance is yours to shape." But when she closed her eyes, she saw more than shadows. She saw the cellar's chains, the crates unloaded in the night, and the ledger in Blackwood's gaze. And she knew her aunt had not simply betrayed her, she had sold her, body and future alike, into a nightmare dressed in silk. The clock in the hall told midnight. Each strike was a reminder. Her chance would come at dawn, and if she failed, there would be no second. In the dark, Charlotte whispered to herself the only vow she could make: "I will endure, and I will not be broken." Outside, the wind rustled the moss in the garden, a hushed applause for courage not yet tested. The mansion breathed like a beast in its sleep. Every corridor of the Blackwood house creaked with weight unseen. Every shadow seemed to shift of its own accord. Charlotte moved through it as though navigating the ribs of a predator that had swallowed her whole. The days blurred together, mornings filled with appropriate lessons under Miss Winthrop's watchful eye, afternoons spent at social calls where Charlotte's every gesture was scrutinized, evenings where Hezekiah Blackwood subjected her to his peculiar brand of courtship. He never spoke of love, only of duty, bloodlines, and legacy. When he looked at her, it was not as a man looks at a companion, but as a collector looks at a vase, an ornament to complete the room. Letters to her sisters were her only lifeline. Under the careful eye of the housekeeper, she wrote about Savannah's streets, the weather, the markets. But her hand pressed harder on certain words, letters darkened with subtle intent. To Abigail, the code was clear. As children, they had devised a game, hiding messages in the thickness of ink or the choice of unusual words. Now those games became signals of survival. Watch the skies, beware the wolf. I endure, but not forever. Still, Blackwood's noose tightened. One afternoon he entered the drawing room while Charlotte practiced scales on the pianoforte. He stood at her shoulder, his hand brushing the back of the bench, a presence both suffocating and calculated. "You are nearly ready," he said. Charlotte kept her eyes on the keys. "Ready for what, sir?" "For your new role. Your aunt and I are in agreement. The ceremony will take place within the month. A marriage swiftly concluded prevents complications." Her hands faltered on the keys. The discordant note hung in the air like a scream. "You can't," she began, but his interruption was sharp. "I can, and I will. Your aunt has already accepted an advance. You will bring stability to this house and heirs to my name. That is all that is required of you." The cold certainty in his voice stole her breath. Charlotte rose quickly, retreating to the safety of the library. There she found Edward, bent over a book but watching her with eyes that saw too much. "He said the wedding is to be within weeks," she whispered, her voice breaking. Edward's face tightened. "Then we have less time than I feared." He produced the brass key again, pressing it into her palm. "The garden gate. At dawn tomorrow, Hezekiah leaves for Charleston. That will be your only chance." Charlotte clutched it, trembling. "And my sisters? If I go, what happens to them?" Edward's sigh was heavy, his voice laced with regret. "Your aunt keeps them in her care, but know this: if you stay, you cannot save them. Freedom for one can become the path for all. If you endure here, they will suffer with you. If you escape, you may yet find a way back for them." That night, Charlotte sat at her desk, her candle burning low, the shadows dancing long against the walls. She began another letter. Mrs. Winthrop hovered nearby, her sharp eyes catching every stroke of the quill. "I hope this letter finds you well," Charlotte wrote, her hand steady though her heart raced. "The weather here is oppressive, though I am told one grows accustomed to confinement." She pressed harder on the letters. "OPEN. The city holds me fast, but I still remember the stars at Willow Creek. Another coded plea: look up, look beyond." She sealed the envelope. Mrs. Winthrop collected it without a word. When the house finally slept, Charlotte lay awake with the brass key hidden beneath her pillow. Each heartbeat counted the hours until dawn. She imagined the sound of the gate opening, the feel of night air unchained, the rush of the harbor where ships carried passengers away from the South and its shackles. But fear whispered too. What if Cooper was watching? What if Edward's help was a trap? What if she fled, only to find herself dragged back in disgrace, punished not only with her freedom but with her sisters' lives? She closed her eyes. She remembered Hannah's twins, their newborn cries louder than the storm that had raged outside Willow Creek. She remembered Abigail's soft insistence: "We must find another way." She remembered her father's words: "Fear is the shadow. You, child, are the substance." Charlotte opened her eyes to the dark, the key biting cold against her palm. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tomorrow, I choose." And as the clock struck midnight, the first whisper of dawn still hours away, Charlotte knew that the line between her captivity and her freedom had narrowed to a single perilous step. The dawn Charlotte had waited for broke soft and pale, a muted grey that blurred the edges of Savannah's rooftops. The mansion still slumbered, its windows shuttered, its servants only beginning their day. Hezekiah Blackwood had departed hours earlier for Charleston, his carriage wheels fading into the distance like a blessing disguised as thunder. Charlotte dressed quickly, layering a shawl over her plainest gown. Beneath it, she concealed a small bundle, Edward's letter, a change of clothes, and the coin he had pressed into her hand. The brass key felt heavy in her pocket, as though it carried the weight of every decision she had not yet made. She slipped from her room, padding softly along the hall. Mrs. Winthrop was nowhere in sight. The house seemed to breathe around her, each creak of the floorboards an accusation. At the garden gate, the lock yielded with a clean, merciful click. She stepped out into the narrow alley, her heart hammering against her ribs. Edward's instructions were clear: move quickly but without haste, blend with the bustle of the docks, board the Northern Star. The ship was bound for Philadelphia, a city where abolitionists had built networks strong enough to swallow secrets whole. The harbor was a chaos of sound, sailors shouting, gulls wheeling, carts clattering across cobblestones. Charlotte forced herself to move with purpose, to look like any other traveler. She reached the wharf where the Northern Star prepared to sail. Its crew shouted orders, hoisting barrels and crates. The gangplank was within reach. Then a hand clamped down on her arm. "Found you." The voice slid into her ear like a knife. Thomas Cooper. His breath was hot with triumph. He dragged her from the gangplank toward a waiting carriage. "Your little trick with the key was clever," he sneered, "but inadequate. Your place is with Mr. Blackwood, and he doesn't appreciate disobedience. Charlotte's cry for help was lost in the din of the harbor. She struggled, twisting against his grip, but Cooper's hand was iron. He shoved her towards the carriage, the door yawning open like a grave. "Release that young woman immediately." The command rang across the dock, cutting through the noise. A uniformed officer strode forward, flanked by two armed men. A federal marshal. Cooper froze, his hand tightening painfully on Charlotte's wrist. "This is a private matter," Cooper snapped. "The girl is under my employer's protection." The marshal produced a folded document, the seal of the United States glinting in the morning Sunday. "We have a warrant concerning illegal activities at the Blackwood residence. This young woman may possess information vital to our investigation." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Cooper's eyes. Charlotte seized the moment. She wrenched free and stumbled toward the marshal, her voice breaking with urgency. "He's right, there are captives hidden in the Blackwood cellars. They're smuggling enslaved Africans, claiming them as children of their own people. I've seen it myself." The marshal steadied her, his face grim. "Then you are precisely who we need." He signaled his men. Two agents moved to seize Cooper, whose hand darted to a concealed weapon. The struggle was brief, brutal, and ended with Cooper shackled, cursing as he was dragged away. Charlotte stood trembling, staring at the harbor, and there, leaning heavily on a cane at the rail of the Northern Star, was Edward Blackwood. His frail figure was a beacon in the chaos. He raised a hand in farewell, his thin smile carrying something like relief. Beside him stood a young woman whose resemblance to the portrait of Hezekiah's late wife was undeniable. Margaret Blackwood's sister, the marshal later explained, who had gathered evidence for years. The ship's bell rang. The Northern Star prepared to depart. The marshal urged Charlotte forward. "Go, you'll be safer in the north. We'll handle the rest." Charlotte hesitated, turning back one last time. "My sisters Abigail and Mary, they're still at Willow Creek with my aunt. Please." "Already in motion," the marshal said. "Another detachment has been dispatched." Charlotte's throat closed with relief and terror entwined. She boarded the ship as the gangplank was pulled away. The sails billowed, catching the morning wind, carrying her northward. 17 days later, Philadelphia rose before her, its skyline a forest of steeples and chimneys. The September air was crisp, edged with autumn, so different from the thick heat of Georgia. She stepped onto northern soil for the first time, the salt sting of the sea still clinging to her hair. She was free, or at least freer than she had ever been. Yet her heart was heavy with the weight of what she had left behind. Every gull's cry reminded her of Mary's laughter, every passing carriage of Abigail's quiet steadiness. Charlotte lifted her eyes to the unfamiliar city, her father's words echoing again. "Fear is a shadow, you are the substance." She whispered into the northern wind, "I will find them, I swear it." And with that vow, she walked into Philadelphia's crowded streets, unaware that her story and her sister's was only beginning. Philadelphia greeted Charlotte with a strange collision of sensations, freedom and fear, hope and grief. The air was brisk, edged with wood smoke and iron, so unlike the humid sweetness of Georgia. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, vendors shouted their wares, and the sheer variety of voices, Irish, German, Quaker Plain speech, made her dizzy. This city did not know her name. It did not know Willow Creek or Elizabeth Thornwell. For the first time in months, Charlotte could walk without being recognized, but anonymity was not the same as safety. The marshal who had escorted her north placed her in the care of a Quaker boarding house run by Ruth Pennington, a stern but kind-eyed woman who welcomed strangers as though it were her vocation. The house smelled of bread and lavender soap. Charlotte slept that first night in a small bed beneath a patchwork quilt, waking again and again at the faintest sound, her hand reaching for the locket at her neck. Inside were miniature portraits of her sisters, Abigail's calm gaze, Mary's round-cheeked innocence. They were her compass, her tether. Days passed in suspended anticipation. Charlotte assisted Ruth with household accounts, scrubbed vegetables, even read aloud to a young Irish maid who wished to improve her letters. But every task was performed with half a heart, because the other half lived in fear and in longing. Fear of Blackwood's reach stretching northward, longing for word of Abigail and Mary. Then, one grey morning, Ruth appeared at the door holding a telegram. Charlotte's hands trembled as she unfolded the thin yellow paper. Subject secure. Arriving Philadelphia, October, Quatorze stop. Meet Central Station, noon stop. Marshall. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. They're alive. The days until October 14 passed with an intensity that left her restless and sleepless. She paced, prepared lodgings, imagined every possible outcome. When the appointed morning came, she stood on the platform at Central Station, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. The noon train hissed into the station, billowing steam. Passengers spilled onto the platform, their voices a jumble. Charlotte scanned every face, her pulse racing. "Charlotte!" The cry cut through the noise. She turned and Mary flew into her arms, thinner than memory but bright-eyed with relief. Abigail followed, slower, composed as always, but her composure crumbled as soon as Charlotte embraced her. The sisters clung to each other, sobbing, laughing, unable to speak. Around them, the world blurred into unimportance. When at last they pulled apart, a marshal stood nearby, his face the same grim kindness Charlotte remembered from Savannah's docks. "We reached Willow Creek 2 days after your escape," he explained quietly as they walked together. "Your aunt had already fled, taking what she could. Cooper's associate resisted arrest. He was shot." "And the enslaved people?" Charlotte asked urgently. "They're under federal protection until the courts decide ownership. But evidence suggests your father intended emancipation for many. His lawyer had copies of papers your aunt claimed were lost." Charlotte's breath caught. Her father's quiet intentions, hidden from Elizabeth, were at last finding light. Back at Ruth Pennington's boarding house, the sisters huddled together on a narrow bed, filling in the gaps of their stories. Abigail described Elizabeth's cruelty: meals withheld, books burned, Mary locked in the attic after trying to warn Hannah about being sold. Mary, pale and trembling, recounted overhearing Elizabeth plotting to declare her unstable, unfit for marriage, an excuse to rid herself of another liability. Charlotte listened, holding their hands, rage and relief warring within her. "We're safe now," she whispered. But the words felt fragile, brittle as spun glass. Philadelphia offered no grand mansions, no rows of enslaved people bending under a master's gaze. It offered noise, industry, and 1,000 possibilities. But possibility required money, and money was scarce. The marshal's office had provided a small stipend, compensation they called it, for cooperation in the investigation. But it would last only a few months. They sat together one evening at the kitchen table, candlelight flickering across their faces. Charlotte spread the accounts before them. "We must make our own way now. Father gave us more education than most girls receive. We must use it." Abigail nodded. "I've a head for numbers. There are merchants here who need bookkeepers." "You right," Mary added softly. "Your words are stronger than you believe. And I..." She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I can teach music. Children who cannot afford fine masters might learn from me." For the first time since their father's death, they spoke of futures shaped by choice rather than command. Weeks passed, and small victories took root. Charlotte found work as a copyist at a publishing house, her ink-stained hands earning coins and, occasionally, glimpses into the minds of Philadelphia's literary circles. Abigail proved herself indispensable at a dry goods store, her ledgers precise and unflinching. Mary gathered a handful of eager pupils at Ruth's piano, her laughter returning in quiet bursts. The sisters were not debutantes in silk anymore. They were working women, fragile but unbroken, shaping a life from the rubble left by Elizabeth and Hezekiah. Yet shadows remained. One evening, as October winds rattled the shutters, Ruth entered the parlor with another telegram. Her face was grave. She handed it to Charlotte without a word. Charlotte unfolded it slowly, dread already tightening her chest. "Blackwood escaped custody. Stop Cooper still at large. Stop exercise, extreme caution, stop Marshall." The warmth of the fire seemed to vanish. Abigail's hand found Charlotte's. Mary pressed against her shoulder. "He will not stop," Charlotte whispered, staring at the stark black letters. "He will never stop." And for the first time since reaching the north, Charlotte realized freedom was not the same as safety. Their story was not finished. It had only reached its next perilous chapter. Winter in Philadelphia was harsh, the kind that scoured cheeks red and turned every breath into smoke. Yet inside Ruth Pennington's boarding house, warmth lingered, the crackle of the hearth, the smell of bread, the low murmur of neighbors who had become allies. For a fleeting moment, the Thornwell sisters had begun to believe they might build a life in this place until Edward Blackwood arrived with a young woman at his side. Charlotte froze in the doorway of the parlor when she saw him. He leaned heavily on a cane, older and frailer than she remembered, but unmistakable. And beside him stood a girl of about 20, slender, pale, with eyes so sharp they seemed to cut through the room itself. "Forgive our intrusion," Edward said, rising with difficulty, "but circumstances demand discretion. This is Catherine Blackwood, Hezekiah's daughter." Charlotte's pulse quickened. The name alone was poison. Abigail shifted uneasily, Mary pressed closer to her sisters, her face wary. "Why have you come?" Charlotte asked. Suspicion edged into her voice. "You're Hezekiah's daughter. Why betray him now?" Catherine stepped forward, her hands clenched. "Because my sister Margaret is dead. They say it was typhoid. But I have letters from her closest friend describing symptoms consistent with poison. 2 weeks before she died, Margaret wrote to me that she had found papers in Father's study, records of how he systematically poisoned our mother when she began questioning his business practices." The words hit the room like stones breaking glass. Charlotte felt cold rise through her. She had suspected Blackwood capable of cruelty, but murder of his own wife turned his ambition into monstrosity. Edward placed a trembling hand on Catherine's shoulder. "Hezekiah does not see children as family. He sees them as assets, liabilities." Catherine became inconvenient when she began asking questions. Catherine's voice hardened. "And now he means to arrange my marriage to one of his associates, a man 40 years older, known for breaking wives into obedience. If I do not escape, I will share my mother's fate." Silence fell heavy. Abigail broke it first, her eyes sharp. "And what is it you want from us?" Catherine reached into her satchel, producing several folded papers, ledgers, correspondence, shipping manifests, proof. These documents show illegal slave trading, bribery of officials, corruption that reaches into Washington. Alone, they are not enough. But with the evidence already gathered by federal marshals, they could collapse his empire. Your connection to Marshal Jennings gives us a chance to get this into the right hands. Abigail frowned, cautious as ever. "Or it could be a trap. How do we know you're not here to lure us out, to bring us back under his hand?" Mary, quiet until now, shook her head. "I believe her. It sounds just like Aunt Elizabeth. Control, disposing of women who became inconvenient. We've lived it too." Charlotte paced, torn between caution and conviction. Catherine's story matched everything they knew of Hezekiah's methods, everything they feared. But trusting her meant risking exposure, and exposure meant danger for them all. "If we do nothing," Charlotte said finally, "Blackwood will regroup. He and Elizabeth will find us. If we act and fail, we may not live to try again. But if we act and succeed—" She met Catherine's eyes. "Then perhaps we can end him." The plan took shape in whispered conferences that stretched past midnight. Charlotte would continue coded correspondence with Marshal Jennings, arranging a secure transfer of evidence. Catherine would provide sworn testimony details only an insider could know. Abigail would organize the documents with her meticulous skill. Mary, resourceful in ways her sisters had underestimated, began enlisting the neighborhood children she tutored as lookouts, their watchful eyes reporting strangers in the streets. Yet the danger was not abstract. Signs of pursuit soon appeared. At Wilson's Tavern, men with southern accents were overheard asking about 3 young women. On the streets, well-dressed strangers lingered too long. Charlotte felt their shadows lengthen over the boarding house, the noose tightening once more. The sisters convened one night in Ruth's kitchen, the fire low, their voices hushed. Catherine sat with them, her eyes haunted but unflinching. "They know Charlotte's face best," Edward said grimly, tapping his cane against the floor. "She is the primary target. If we move, we must move cleverly. Separate routes, separate disguises, divide the risk." Charlotte's heart thudded. She had faced fear before, but now it felt different. Not just survival, but justice was at stake. Hezekiah Blackwood was not merely her captor, he was a predator who poisoned wives, trafficked human lives, and corrupted the very institutions meant to stop him. She looked at Abigail, at Mary, at Catherine. Each of them had already suffered in his shadow. "We can't live like prey," Charlotte whispered. "Not forever. It ends with us." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, as though the room itself exhaled, Ruth Pennington nodded firmly. "Then we will act. But know this, when you strike at such men, they strike back harder. You must be ready." Charlotte's hand tightened on the documents Catherine had brought. They felt like a weapon, sharper than any blade. She was ready, or at least, she told herself she was. And somewhere, in Savannah or beyond, Hezekiah Blackwood was preparing too. The collision was coming, and when it came, it would be written in blood and iron. The morning train to Baltimore steamed like a great iron beast, its breath rising in white plumes that mingled with the frosty air. Charlotte stood on the platform with Catherine Blackwood at her side, her shawl pulled tightly against the cold. Behind them, Dr. Blackwell adjusted her medical satchel, her sharp eyes scanning every passerby. The plan was simple, but perilous. Travel openly, drawing the hunter's eyes, while Edward and Abigail took a slower carriage route, with the actual evidence hidden in plain ledgers. Charlotte felt the weight of risk settle in her bones. Every step toward the train felt like stepping onto a stage where the wrong word, the wrong movement, would bring the curtain down in violence. They boarded and found seats in the forward car. For 2 hours the journey passed in strained silence, broken only by the murmur of passengers. Catherine sat with her gaze fixed on the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charlotte pretended to doze, though her senses prickled. She could feel eyes on them. At Wilmington, the tension crystallized. 2 men boarded the car, polished, southern in dress and accent. One, tall with a gold tooth flashing when he smiled, tipped his hat toward Charlotte. "Miss Thornwell," he said smoothly. "Thomas Cooper sends his regards." Her pulse leapt, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "You are mistaken, sir. My name is Bennett, Dr. Blackwell's niece." His smile widened, wolfish. "My mistake, ma'am, though you bear a remarkable resemblance to someone of my acquaintance." He returned to his seat, but Charlotte saw the truth in his eyes. They knew. Dr. Blackwell leaned close, her voice low. "Stay calm. Baltimore Station will have federal marshals waiting. Until then, we must play the part." But as the train slowed at a rural platform for water, Charlotte's stomach dropped. Through the window she saw several men standing at intervals, too carefully placed to be casual passengers. The hunters had chosen this spot, far from the safety of Baltimore. "They're going to take us here," Charlotte whispered. Dr. Blackwell's eyes hardened. She tightened her grip on her satchel. "When I create a distraction, you move forward through the cars. Don't stop. Don't look back." Before Charlotte could protest, the gold-toothed man rose, reaching inside his jacket. In the same instant, Dr. Blackwell surged to her feet, swinging the satchel in a brutal arc. It caught him across the face with a sickening crack. The car erupted in chaos, passengers shouting, children crying, the conductor rushing forward. "Now," Dr. Blackwell barked. Charlotte seized Catherine's hand. They pushed through the panicked crowd, shoving open the door to the next car, then the next. Behind them, shouts rose, pursuers breaking through, men demanding their capture. Charlotte's lungs burned, but she kept pulling, weaving through startled passengers. At the forward car, only the tender and engine remained. The engineer turned in shock as the 2 young women burst inside. "Ladies, you can't." "Federal business," Catherine snapped, her voice trembling but forceful. "Those men are fugitives." The engineer hesitated. Charlotte's eyes darted upward to a maintenance ladder leading onto the roof. "Up," she commanded. "We cross over." They climbed, the wind slashing at their faces as they crawled across the coal-dusted tender. Behind them, shouts grew louder, footsteps, curses, gunmetal flashing. Ahead, the woods stretched endless and dark, a promise of concealment if they could only reach them. Then a shot cracked the air. Birds erupted from the trees. Catherine stumbled, nearly falling, but Charlotte dragged her onward. And then thunder of hooves. A carriage barreled down the dirt road, paralleling the tracks, wheels bouncing dangerously. Edward Blackwood clung to the reins, Abigail braced beside him, and in the rear stood Marshal Jennings, rifle at the ready. "Charlotte!" Abigail cried. With a final desperate leap, Charlotte and Catherine scrambled down the embankment, stumbling into the road as the carriage slowed just enough. Hands reached out, Abigail's grip catching Charlotte's, Marshal Jennings pulling Catherine aboard. The carriage lurched forward, careening away as bullets whined past, striking dirt and splintering wood. Jennings fired back, forcing the pursuers into cover. The train began to move again, carrying their hunters away in frustration. Charlotte collapsed against her sister, breathless, trembling. "The evidence?" she gasped. "Delivered yesterday," Abigail said, gripping her hand. "Safe with the marshals." Edward turned briefly, his frail face lined with strain but his eyes fierce. "We bought you a few hours, maybe days, but Hezekiah will not stop, not until he is broken or until he breaks us." The carriage thundered toward Baltimore, the wind whipping tears from Charlotte's eyes. Behind them, Savannah's shadow stretched northward still, relentless as ever. She looked at Abigail, at Mary's empty place waiting for them, at Catherine's haunted gaze. The battle was not won, it had only begun. Charlotte whispered, almost to herself, "It's not over, but this time we will strike first." Marshal Jennings nodded grimly, his rifle across his knees. "Then prepare yourselves, because the darkness has only just begun." The road bent into shadow, the carriage vanishing into it like a single fragile flame carried into a storm.